was obvious you wouldn't be able to solve this problem. It's not that the knowledge doesn't exist, it does. I can see that it's hidden inside tax codes, central bank reports, and laws written by people who benefit from your confusion. But as long as you remain confused, the trick works. The game changes the moment you understand what's really happening. Not for you, for them. So let's talk about this openly, without using the sanitized language governments prefer. Governments have been manipulating money in the same way for more than 2,000 years. The words are not the same, the faces are not the same, but at its core, the mechanism is identical. Take from the majority, concentrate toward the minority, and make the transfer invisible. Dress it in the language of care, cover it with emergency, label it as reform, and assume most people are too busy surviving to notice what's moving while their attention is elsewhere. This is not a conspiracy. This is history. And if you don't know this history, you are not just uninformed, you are vulnerable. Let's start from the beginning, because to understand how this trick works today, you need to see where it was born. And it began in the simplest place. A coin. 3rd century Rome. The empire is bleeding. Wars on every border, pressure from northern tribes, and an army that hasn't been paid for weeks. Faced with this kind of pressure, emperors had one problem and one very tempting solution. The problem was simple. There wasn't enough silver. The solution was even simpler. Pretend there was. The denarius, Rome's most trusted currency, once contained nearly pure silver. It was real. It was heavy. You could feel its value in your hand. But quietly over decades, emperors began reducing its silver content, a little at a time, 10% less, then 20, then 50. By the end of the 3rd century, a coin that once contained 90% silver held almost 5%. The rest was copper, coated with a thin layer of silver to make it look real. The empire kept calling it a denarius. Merchants were legally required to accept it, and for a while people did. Then prices began to rise. Bread became more expensive. Rent increased. The soldiers' pay didn't change, but it bought less each month. Lifetimes of savings began to evaporate, and the average Roman citizen had no idea why. He didn't know anything about the mint. He didn't know anything about silver content. All he knew was that something was wrong. Life was getting harder without a clear reason, and the emperor kept telling him the empire had never been stronger. Does this sound familiar? It should, because that coin, that debased, hollowed-out coin wrapped in a silver lie, is the direct ancestor of every monetary policy tool used today. The names have changed. The mechanisms have been cleaned up through centuries of academic language. But the function is the same. Spend beyond your means. Don't admit it. Quietly reduce the value of everyone's money and let the public absorb the loss without ever realizing they've been taxed. Modern governments call this monetary expansion, or inflation targeting. Choose any term. Strip away the jargon, and it means we created more money, which means the money you already had is worth less, and we did it without asking you. Here's what that looks like in numbers. Between 2020 and 2023, the United States Federal Reserve expanded its balance sheet by roughly $4 trillion. That money didn't come from taxes, it didn't come from growth. It was created digitally at a keyboard. And within 18 months, inflation reached its highest level in 40 years. Grocery bills rose, rents surged, energy costs increased, and every financial authority in Washington went in front of a microphone and blamed supply chains, the pandemic, Russia, or corporate greed. Everything except themselves. So where did this new money go first? Financial markets, asset prices, the balance sheets of banks and funds holding government bonds. By the time inflation reached your grocery shelf, the wealthy had already secured their gains. Real estate had surged. Stock portfolios had expanded. The gap between those who own assets and those who don't widened quietly, systematically. This is not an accident. It's part of the architecture, and it has a name. Economists call it the Cantillon Effect, named after an 18th century banker who noticed something still not emphasized enough in textbooks. New money does not enter the economy evenly. It enters from the top. It flows through financial markets, banks, and asset holders, and by the time it reaches ordinary households' wages and savings, its purchasing power has already been reduced along the way. The wealthy get the money first while it still holds full value. You get it last after inflation has taken its share. This is not a design flaw, this is the design. Now let's talk about debt. Because inflation is only half the story, the other half is more elegant and far more permanent. Let's go back to 1694. England is at war with France and the king is out of money. Not temporarily, structurally bankrupt. So a group of wealthy London merchants strike a deal with the crown. They will lend the government £1.5 million. In return, they receive something unprecedented. Guaranteed interest payments backed not by a king's personal promise, but by the state's power to tax. The Bank of England is born, and with it a new financial instrument that will reshape civilization, the government bond. It sounds reasonable, even generous. The wealthy lend, the government borrows, everyone benefits. But look at who paid for it. The interest on those bonds was funded by taxes. Taxes on salt, beer, cloth, goods consumed not by wealthy merchants but by ordinary workers who didn't have the capital to lend to kings. Ideas didn't buy bonds. They couldn't. They bought bread, and invisibly a portion of every loaf went to bondholders. 330 years later, the structure is the same. The United States government now pays over $1 trillion a year in interest on its national debt, not principal, just interest. That interest is paid from tax revenue. Tax revenue comes from workers, consumers, households across the economic spectrum. And that money flows to holders of treasury bonds, pension funds, sovereign wealth funds, banks, and wealthy individuals with significant fixed income portfolios. The government borrows, markets collect. The public funds the system and is told it's for their benefit. And when the debt becomes too large to comfortably service, governments don't cut from the top. They never do. They raise consumption taxes. They means test social benefits. They quietly increase retirement ages. They inflate the currency, reducing the real value of pensions without announcing cuts. Every measure is framed in the language of necessity and sacrifice, but it always falls hardest on those least able to bear it. That's the trick. It has always been the trick. And it works because most people never see the whole board. They focus on what's in front of them. A tax bill, rising grocery prices, a retirement reform announcement. They don't connect these to trillion-dollar interest payments, monetary expansion programs from 3 years ago, or bailout packages that privatize gains and socialize losses. The system is intentionally fragmented so cause and effect never appear in the same frame. Let's talk about 2008 because it offers the clearest modern example of how this works when the mask slips. Banks spent years packaging fraudulent mortgage products into securities, selling them globally, collecting enormous fees at every stage, and building leverage ratios that would make a Roman emperor's accounting look conservative. The collapse hit global credit markets. Governments intervened. Hundreds of billions in public funds were injected into institutions deemed too big to fail. That argument wasn't wrong. The banks were too big to fail. But something wasn't said loudly enough. Those banks had been allowed to become that large through decades of regulatory capture, where industries gradually took control of the agencies meant to oversee them. The rules that could have prevented the crisis were systematically removed by the very institutions that later required rescue. And after receiving public funds, those institutions emerged larger, more concentrated, and more systemically important than before. The public paid for the failure. The institutions preserved the profit structure that caused it. And the regulatory framework was rebuilt in a way so complex that it became nearly impossible for the average citizen to trace where the money actually went. Complexity is not bureaucratic inefficiency. It is a feature. Thousands of pages of tax code, financial instruments that require a PhD to price, budget documents buried in acronyms. All of it creates a fog dense enough for wealth transfer to continue unnoticed. If you can't see movement, you can't object. If you can't object, it continues. This is not an accidental property of the system, it is its immune response. But the most important trick is not inflation, debt, or regulatory capture. It is the one that makes all the others possible, the assumption of legitimacy. For centuries, governments have taught people that what they do with money is fundamentally different from what you or I do, that their debt is investment, not liability. Their inflation is growth, not debasement. Their bailouts are stability, not redistribution. Their rules are protection, not capture. And because these systems are old, embedded in institutions that carry the weight of centuries, and because alternative frameworks are rarely presented in mainstream discourse, most people accept the official version without questioning it. When Rome debased the denarius, citizens blamed merchants for rising prices. They didn't blame the mint. Today, when governments create inflation, citizens blame corporations for price increases. They don't trace it back to monetary policy. The anger is redirected. The mechanism remains hidden. The game completes itself. But if you are willing to read history honestly, it teaches something very clear. Every version of this trick works for a time. Rome's debasement led to economic collapse, runaway inflation, and political fragmentation in the 3rd century. The system that replaced it was both worse and better, but the people who lived through the transition did not understand why it happened. They experienced the symptoms before diagnosing the disease. Ignorance does not protect you from economic history. It only ensures it hits you when you least expect it. Today's version of the game is far more sophisticated than anything Rome or 17th century England could imagine. The instruments are more complex, the feedback loops faster, and the language used to describe it dense enough to exhaust anyone without professional training. That density is not accidental. An informed population is a resistant population. Confusion is compliance. So what does resistance look like? It begins with awareness. Inflation is not weather. It is a policy choice with beneficiaries. Debt is not inevitable. It is a structure with architects. Complexity is not neutral, it is camouflage. Every time you hear the word reform in relation to pensions or taxes, ask, reform for whom? Every time a government announces emergency spending, follow the first recipients. Every time a central bank expands its balance sheet, ask who holds the assets that will rise as a result. These are not radical questions, they are the baseline questions of a financially literate citizen. The fact that they seem radical is itself evidence of how thoroughly the system avoids scrutiny. Build outside the traps where possible. Assets that hold value independent of currency debasement. Knowledge that moves across economic regimes. The ability to read a balance sheet, understand bond markets, and distinguish between what a government says it's doing and what the flow of money reveals it's actually doing. The Romans who understood what was happening to the denarius didn't stop it. The system was too entrenched, political will too captured, the population too fragmented. But they protected themselves. They moved into real assets. They traded commodities. They preserved what they could. And when the collapse came, they were not completely unprepared. You are living through a version of this story, not at the end, not yet in total collapse, but as part of a long-running transfer of wealth executed through institutions that appear public but function as mechanisms of transfer. This number is very old. It was never new. What changed is your visibility. Financial education is not a hobby. It is the only durable form of resistance available to ordinary people within a system this deeply embedded. Because knowledge alone does not fix structural inequality, it doesn't. But you cannot protect yourself in a game whose rules you do not understand, and you cannot push for change in a system whose mechanisms you cannot name. The same coin the Romans held for years, feeling it grow lighter without understanding why, is now in your pocket. It is digital. It moves through screens instead of wallets. Language replaces metal and coding replaces silver. But the weight has been decreasing. If this changed how you see the system, subscribe. History holds the answers. I will show you exactly where to look.